Hi, this is Renee Rosen, author of Park Avenue Summer, and you're listening to the Cook Memorial Public Library podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Cook Memorial Public Library podcast. I'm your host, Nate Goss. Today we bring you my conversation with Phil Christman, author of the new book, Midwest Futures. Midwest Futures is a provocative critical exploration of the Midwest, that hard-to-pinpoint geographic area that is, as Christman puts it early on in the book, quote, massively there, constantly eluding our grasp, end quote. Christman, like me and I'm sure a lot of our listeners, grew up and currently lives in the Midwest. In this collection of 36 short, interconnected essays, he uses that personal experience as a starting point from which to tell a unique and surprising history of a place so often characterized as flat, normal, and boring. But in reality is not really any of those things. Along the way, Christman touches on literature, art, politics, race, economics, and just about every discipline you could apply to the subject, and adds a healthy dose of humor for good measure. I first became aware of Christman's writing when a friend of mine shared an essay in the Hedgehog Review titled, appropriately, On Being Midwestern. I immediately fell in love with Christman's writing. We will link to the essay in the show notes, but just to give you a little sample of Christman as a writer, let me read just a few lines from the beginning of Midwest Futures. By the side of Ohio Route 38, about 2 miles past East Liverpool, you can visit the place where the Midwest does not begin. What you can see at that spot is an unassuming little obelisk with a plaque on its front. One historian who traveled, quote, several thousand miles, end quote, to find it still overshot it and had to turn around. On either side is just enough room for a few cars to pull off the road and park. You picture a dad emerging from a station wagon. You hear him intoning in that voice available only to dads, moved to reverence by historical markers. Guys, come look at this, as the children blink. Boy, isn't this something? He finally says, and someone sighs with relief, for he is almost done, and there is no bathroom. McDonald's was miles ago. Well, that is what I pictured anyway one summer afternoon in Ann Arbor, as I gazed at this spot on Google Maps, wondering if I should, like another generation's crusading literature, simply drive there. James Agee would drive there, but James Agee, burdened and guilty as he was, did not yet know about carbon footprints. Back to Google Maps it was then, in my little reverie, a cultural memory of a summer vacationing middle American normality that I feel I should somehow claim, though it is not mine. So much for the little pointed rock that memorializes the place known to history as the beginning point of the U.S. Public Lands Survey. So I hope that should give you a little bit of an idea of what awaits you if you pick up Midwest Futures. Phil Christman currently teaches in the English department at the University of Michigan and is the editor of the Michigan Review of Prisoner Creative Writing, a journal sponsored by the University of Michigan's Prison Creative Arts Project. He was a former substitute teacher, shelter worker, and home health aide. He really is a fascinating author in person, and we had a great conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Well, Phil Christman, welcome to the Cook Memorial Public Library podcast, and congratulations on the book. I just love reading your writing.
Thank you so much, Nate.
Okay, so the book is called Midwest Futures. It's probably most accurately described as a collection of essays on the Midwest. That's probably the most reductive description I can possibly give it. But I'm kind of doing that purposefully because I was thinking maybe a good way to start this off is to maybe have you talk about what you think this book is.
Yeah, I don't want to police other people's reading of it. I do see it as one essay with 36 little pieces. But that's really more just like a heuristic that helped me keep going. The vibe that I was going for, there's a certain kind of short, pointed essay in cultural criticism kind of genre that I think we've seen some pretty strong examples of in the last decade or so. Books like Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism, which that's an amazing book. So Midwest Futures is kind of I'm thinking of books like Capitalist Realism. I'm thinking of books like Kristen Dombeck's The Selfishness of Others, which is a sort of like books that you read them in a sitting, but they really hit you.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually, I've got the book in front of me. It's a very short book. You could sit here and read it in one sitting, although there's a lot to chew on in here. So, even though it's going a lot beyond that, it still is a collection of essays that is sort of ostensibly about the Midwest. And one of the ways that you kind of talk about the Midwest is it's sort of being permanently out of focus. You also sort of mention a lot of the cliches that people typically use when they're talking about the Midwest, bad weather, hard work, humble people. And one of the ones with the most interesting backstories that you get into is the whole flyover country idea. Mm-hmm. And so much of this book seems to be about what the Midwest is not. And I'm wondering if you could talk about where you've landed on what the Midwest is to you.
Yeah, that is a great question. I mean, one of the things that I learned kind of starting from my own inarticulacy about the Midwest, I mean, the way the book is structured and the Hedgehog Review essay that I wrote that the book grew out of, they're both kind of structured around like, boy, this place is hard to characterize. This place is hard to talk about.
And you obviously did grow up in the Midwest, right?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
But it didn't even occur to me to think of it as a particular thing or a particular place, or Midwesternness as something that might be important about me in the way that I think like most of my Southern friends definitely from a very, very early age, they have a real self-consciousness about themselves as Southerners, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the biggest thing that kept impressing itself upon me was the vagueness of the Midwest, and the way that vagueness kind of is constitutive of what the Midwest is. I mean, this is the part of the country that has been the staging ground for so many possible versions of the future of what America will be like. That is our cultural role, and so that means that there is like just a built-in blurriness about it.
Well, what's interesting to me is that you do get into so much about all this of what the Midwest sort of had as far as like promise in it, or I mean, the book's called Midwest Futures. It's this idea that like the Midwest always had this sense of like forecasting what the future could hold, maybe. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm from the Midwest, and all of that was new to me, and so I guess I'm wondering, as you were writing this book, who did you have in mind reading it? Did you think this was going to be a book that was going to be mostly for people in the Midwest, for outsiders, for everyone? Did you have anyone in particular that you were kind of writing to when you wrote this?
Yeah. I mean, that stuff was new to me. That was one of the biggest surprises of my research. The sense of the Midwest as like the future and forward-looking region of America.
Who knew?
I wanted. I mean. If we were having this conversation 80 years ago, lots of people. So the book, I mean, I want anyone to be relatively comfortable reading it, but I mean, I went with a small Midwestern press, and yeah, I was thinking of it as something that Midwesterners would read first, although. In a funny way, I mean, the book is also inspired by, my wife, who is from Texas, kind of trying to force me to be articulate about what Midwesternness is. But I think, like, as I was reading, I wanted other people who have the same background or a similar background to me to read it and be like, whoa, really?
Right.
I didn't know that. Sometimes I state things in a matter-of-fact way that I'm kind of expecting will be surprising to people because they were surprising to me.
Right. The stories that you tell about like all these utopias that kind of popped up in the Midwest, it's like I knew that stuff because I live right by Zion, which was sort of conceived of as a utopia in its time. But it's almost like we downplay that. Like for whatever reason, even though that is a really interesting story, we don't seem to want to think of it that way for some reason.
Yeah, I mean, the town in which I grew up was never intended as a utopia, and and boy, you can tell. I could make a lot of like cheesy insult jokes here, but it turned out to have some pretty interesting things in its history, and it's what I felt growing up. I don't know if this is what you experienced, but I think I'm theorizing that this is a common Midwestern experience. What I felt was that any interesting or important historical thing that had happened in proximity to where I come from was rendered prosaic by the fact of it having happened near where I come from. So maybe a utopian commune would ordinarily be kind of an interesting or revelatory, thing. But, if it just happened right here in Michigan or Wisconsin or Indiana, 20 minutes from where I am, then it's kind of a joke. That is so strange that it's not even really worth talking about. It doesn't really enter into your self-conception of where you're from.
Well, and actually, since you did a lot of this sort of uncovering of these stories, could you talk a little bit about what your research process was like for this book?
Yeah, my research process is kind of like my working process in general for anything I do, which is that I start out several different ways and get about halfway with each of the things. So like one thing I did was, I don't know who this person is, but somebody compiled a bibliography of like Midwest environmental history. Everything that sounded even vaguely interesting, I at least like tried to give it a skim. Then I'd get bored with that approach and I would just do the approach where you go to the section of the U of M library that's devoted to the Midwest, books about the Midwest, and just grab everything that looks halfway interesting. So my research process is both methodical and messy in that way. I'm being methodical, but I'm switching from one to the other kind of semi-randomly. And that sounds like it shouldn't work, but for whatever reason, it led me to so much stuff, which I think is just because the subject is incredibly fertile and there just is a lot of stuff. There's a possible universe where I find several completely different themes with which to talk about the Midwest and write an equally interesting book, you know?
It is such a huge topic. It's a huge topic, but maybe because it's the Midwest, we don't feel like it should be.
Yeah, it is. It is that weird, like displaced colonial humility that Midwesterners have about ourselves. That there's like, oh, little old me, no way.
You kind of matched the structure of your book to the geography you were talking about, in the sense that not only is this a book of essays, but you particularly did them 6 rows each containing 6 plats of approximately 1,000 words. It's a pretty clever way to do the book. And then on top of that, I really love the cover of the book, which is just, it really illustrates exactly what you're doing in it. And if you're looking at it from afar, it almost looks like it would be like a tile backsplash on a kitchen or a bathroom. And it took me a while.
You would not believe how many people have said that to me, that like it's taken like weeks for them to realize that they are looking at a picture of farmland taken from like a helicopter or airplane. Yeah.
Well, it's just so perfect. It's so perfectly grid-like, and the greens even I think are shockingly like one tone within each square. But yeah, it's a great cover. It's a great structure. How did you settle on that structure for this book?
Yeah, I'm trying to. By the way, I'm trying to look up the name of the book design studio that did that, so that I can give them credit.
It says cover design David Wilson and book design Meredith Pangrace.
Yeah, well, shout out to those people. God bless them. Yeah, I wish I could take credit for that. I was actually playing with the idea of changing the title at one point, and when I saw that book design, I was like, oh, okay.
Nope, there it is.
Nope. Yeah, I am
Don't
not
touch it. Yeah,
exactly. I am not touching this. But the question was about how I wound up with the structure that I did. I mean, yeah, the first draft of the book was... I unearthed a lot of the stuff that I needed to talk about, but it was a little bit formless because I didn't know exactly how to proceed with it formally. So I just kind of talked. And my publisher, Anne Trebek, she said, you seem like someone who would be into the writers of the Oulipo group, which is a loose network of writers that included Italo Calvino and Raymond Queneau and like various other, pretty cool people who come up with these very difficult and arbitrary structures for their books to follow. And she said, what if we did something along those lines? And I went back and forth on that for a long time because I didn't want it to seem gimmicky. And then I happened to be reading John McPhee's book. I think it's called Draft Number 4. It's his book about writing from a couple of years ago, which is terrific. And he just keeps saying the subject will give you the structure. And I was like, well, okay, that seems like pretty on the nose advice from the universe. But also for me, I just want to include everything and talk about everything, right? And so the 36 pieces, 1,000 words each, divided into 6 sort of rows. So there's a kind of thematic shift. That let me know when I was done, which is incredibly helpful for someone like me.
I think what could be a little surprising to readers of this book, because it is, at least on the cover and in the jacket, it's supposed to be just about the Midwest, right? But how much you actually bring in your own personal political and even religious views, how they kind of seep into these essays. And, it becomes evident pretty quickly that you're, progressive. And even if it wasn't already evident by the end, you talk about joining the Democratic Socialists of America. You talk about being a Christian. And I guess the question I want to ask is, I want to ask why bring your personal political and religious views into these at all, but that makes it sound like a criticism, when really I think it's actually what gives the book a lot of life. So I guess I'm just wondering, was there ever a choice that you made to do that, or was it just something that was just always going to be there?
Yeah, no, I get what you're asking. I mean, it wasn't ever really a choice. In the 1990s, when literary theory heads were running around making the argument that there isn't a truly apolitical stance, there's just politics that don't declare themselves. As kids say on the internet now, I felt that. I mean, I'm not, well, and I even talk about this in the book, I will decry people being mean to each other, or people being pointlessly cruel to each other, till the cows come home. But I don't decry politicization or even polarization as such, because to me, that just means you're being articulate with yourself about what your priors are, because I don't think there is a view from nowhere, and I don't think they're either politically or philosophically. So that's where the religious stuff comes in. You're always looking at the universe from a particular vantage point that is shaped by particular values and assumptions about what reality is for that you have kind of landed on. And it's the same thing in my classes. I teach freshman English. I don't tell them to go look for unbiased sources, because I think that's lying to them. There are no unbiased sources. Wikipedia is not unbiased. It's just clueless about its own biases. I tell them to try to be honest. So if you uncover like a good, well-sourced piece of evidence that goes against what you want to think, then you still have to like reckon with it. I think that's a better message than trying to appear neutral. So that's just kind of my general approach to those things that spills over everywhere.
A partner and I, we teach the fake news classes at the library, and we don't tell people to try to seek out unbiased sources either. We tell them to understand your bias and try to understand where the bias is and everywhere else.
Exactly right. Anybody who reads my book or takes my classes, they know what they're getting. It just seems fairer.
Sure, that's true, yeah. But I guess, as a follow-up to that, you had to know that not everyone reading this book would agree with you and your politics. So I guess what do you hope to maybe get across to those readers, or maybe even, I know that there's going to be listeners, who are listening to this podcast from our library. What do you hope to maybe get to people who are not going to see eye to eye with you in that regard? What do you hope they get out of the book, I guess?
Look, I mean, I knew my parents were going to read this.
Yeah, you talk about them in there. And it's beautiful, by the way. That's one of my favorite parts of the book, actually.
Thank you. I mean, I worried about how they would respond, and they've been great, about the book. I was wrestling over that constantly. I mean, well, I think one thing that I hope people will get out of this and really hear it is simply the amount of wrestling that went into it.
Yeah.
I think we tend to want to understand our political opponents as cartoons. Mm-hmm. I guess I wanted people to see how you reach the conclusions that I reach, how you come to have the worldview that I have to some extent. I tried to talk about my family in the book in a way that is critical and loving and not oversimplifying. And I still worry about how well I hit that balance. I want to make the world not worse. So
Right.
I'm hoping they'll get that. I'm hoping that they'll read the book and feel like I'm taking them seriously, even if I'm taking them seriously in opposition.
You have a really particularly, I think, sharp and precise section in your book about Midwestern racism. And you use this term where you call the history of the Midwest a history of, quote, racial quarantine. Could you just talk a little bit about what you mean by that and how it applies to, specifically the Midwest?
Yeah. I mean, basically, one of the things that I probably shouldn't have been so surprised about, but really was in the process of my research is just learning that you, listener, if you live in a town like the town I grew up in, and you just don't think about race that much because there just aren't that many Black people. Mm-hmm. So the subject doesn't arise. I mean, that was how I thought about racism for a good period of my life. I thought of it as, a thing that people in the South got weirdly angry about, right? Mm-hmm. The fact that there are not a lot of Black people in certain towns in the Midwest and certain neighborhoods in Midwestern cities, that's not some accident. That came about as a result of well-documented policies that you can get just like the tip of the iceberg of it in my book. But if you want to delve further into it, you can read The Origins of the Urban Crisis by Thomas Segru. You can read The Color of Law, which just came out a few years ago. Mm-hmm. There's all sorts of books out there. You can look up what parts of the country have been historic Ku Klux Klan strongholds, and you'll find all sorts of towns in Indiana. You'll find mm-hmm. towns in Michigan listed. You can read up on sundown towns. Like it's all there. I think a lot of people don't know that history, and
it was new to me within the last few years. I got to be honest. It was not taught to me. I'll put it that way. In public school. And my family never taught it to me either.
It wasn't taught to me either. I think it's important to know that has been a thing here.
So I wanted to ask, so the first line of your bio in the book, it says you're a former substitute teacher, shelter worker, and home health aide. Currently you work as the editor of the Michigan Review of Prisoner Creative Writing out of the University of Michigan. And I guess, I don't know, it struck me because I wouldn't say that reads like the typical author bio I've read. I mean, taken in total, I think what I gather is that you're someone who cares deeply about people and has at least occupationally served others in very different life situations than yours. How has that informed your worldview and your writing?
Well, first of all, thank you. That's super flattering. That bio makes me sound way cooler than I am. Those are things that I did during my kind of postgraduate flounder. In my heart, I always wanted to be a writer, but I was worried that I'd go to graduate school and then I'd get, trapped in the ivory tower mm-hmm. and I'd become a snob and what a stupid thing to be worried about given the economics of higher ed. I mean, if you go to graduate school in the humanities, what's going to happen is if you're lucky, you'll find a teaching gig where you're doing freshman English, in which case you will not forget what society looks like.
That's a good point.
And that's good.
Yeah.
So I tried different things, and what it doesn't say in the bio is that I wasn't that good at any of them. I was better at writing, and I was as soon as I went to graduate school and went into the classroom, like it was an immediate click. Like, oh, of course, this was what I was supposed to be doing. I guess I've just tried to be, and I don't want to take credit for this as an accomplished thing. But I try to be conscious of the underdog. I try to be conscious of people who've taken a lot of punches from life, and I think my life is better as a result of that because I don't know, I have more friends. That's pretty cool.
So we are, right now in the middle of a worldwide pandemic. Which, unless you had psychic powers, I'm sure you didn't foresee as you were writing this book. But, so much of the book and even its title does come from this idea that we already talked about throughout history of the Midwest kind of yoking itself to this idea of the future and trying to control the future. And here we are in this kind of unprecedented time of national uncertainty, at least in my lifetime, unprecedented. And I guess I'm just wondering if you've even recently made any new observations lately about the Midwest. Has anything struck you as characteristically Midwestern in the responses you've seen?
This is kind of a dull answer in some ways, but I think we've lived up to both the dystopian and utopian parts of the picture that I'm trying to paint in the book. Mm-hmm. I was on a panel the other day where people were asking, do you have any hope, after kind of watching how people have responded to the pandemic? And honestly, I'm pleasantly surprised by humanity and by American humanity in particular at the moment. The fact that mutual aid has gone from being a thing anarchists talk about to being there are all these mutual aid pods that are popping up in neighborhoods all over the place. I think I am seeing people respond with a generosity that capitalism doesn't necessarily tell us we should have. I mean, I expected us as a culture to retreat into ourselves and kind of adopt an I've got mine, Jack attitude, which I'm not seeing from normal people. I am only seeing it from the kinds of people who want my immunocompromised mother to die so that they can go back to Applebee's. Yeah. And that's not that many people. We talk about them all the time. It's 25% that don't support the lockdowns at this point. That is a couple more percentage points than people who think that aliens regularly do invasive medical procedures to random people. I didn't think Americans were still that in touch with reality, frankly, that it would be as high as 75% approving.
Yeah. I wanted to just for a moment just pivot to books.
Yep.
Belt, your publisher, they actually specialize in Midwest authors. Is that correct?
Yep. Midwest authors, great. Midwest subjects. Yeah.
I'm just curious if you have, and they don't necessarily need to come from, Belt Publishing, but, who are some of your favorite Midwest authors? If our listeners kind of wanted to dive into some of your favorite Midwest books, whether they take place there or are written by Midwest authors.
Okay, this is the point where this becomes a 2-part interview because I could go on for way too long. I'll go fast.
Okay.
Contemporary and recent. Yes, do check out my fellow Belt writers. One reason I went with them is that every project they do, they're really serious about. So my friend Rachel's book, Rust Belt Femme, or Vivian Gibson's book about what it's like to experience gentrification in the Midwest. I mean, that's a story that hasn't been documented enough. Belt's great. I support my teammates. More generally, I think Marilyn Robinson is one of the greatest living writers in the English language. Oh yeah. So there's that.
I'm with you completely there.
Gwendolyn Brooks, I think she gets read in the African American lit class. She's so completely a Chicago writer. She's so devoted to Chicago, and she's also just one of those writers. She just doesn't have any. It's all hits. She doesn't have any bad poems.
Yeah.
All hits. William Gass, he can be quite demanding and sometimes off-putting, but he is breathtaking when he's on. David Rhodes is a writer who I admire quite a bit. He lives in Wisconsin, and he's published 5 novels, but with a 30-year gap between them. I've just recently gotten into Louise Erdrich. I don't know why. Yeah. I don't know what I was waiting on, but oh my God, what a wonderful writer. I mean, just incredibly vivid, believable people. I could keep blathering. I mean, one person that people don't know about who's really fascinating is Marguerite Young, who basically wrote 2 small books and then 2 incredibly enormous books that took her 20 years each. And one of them is a surreal psychological novel called Miss Mackintosh, My Darling. And then she also has a book about the utopianism. It's mostly focused on New Harmony, Indiana, called The Angel in the Forest. That is it's incredible. It's so good.
That's quite a list. Now I've got my work cut out for me.
Good. That was the plan.
And then I just want to close out. This is what we always ask. It's the last question we always ask all of our authors on here. And there might even be some you've already mentioned, but what have you been reading lately?
Yeah, I do a new books column for Plow Quarterly. So yeah, there's some stuff coming out that I'm pretty excited about. So the Marilyn Robinson book, Jack. I think it's another Marilyn Robinson all-time banger.
Wow.
It's not at all a come down from the earlier books.
That's so great to hear.
I'm reading Alex Ross's book, Wagnerism, which is he's the classical music critic for The New Yorker, and he's just a wonderful writer. And this is a study of Wagner's influence on 19th and 20th century culture, which, of course, he really can't skirt the whole Nazism issue, and he doesn't. He handles it really beautifully. But I don't know. It's like if you've been studying planets and you suddenly realize that the gravitational warping in a certain area is because there's a planet you just didn't know about. That's kind of what reading this book feels like. He's restoring a dimension of the cultural history of the 19th and 20th centuries that hadn't been there for me. It's one of those books that's kind of an education in and of itself. Really stunning.
Sounds great. Like a cosmic experience for you, it sounds like.
Yeah, that's what I'm always looking for. When I pick up a book, I want my brain to be a little bit rewritten.
Yes.
If that doesn't happen, I get mad.
Thankfully, I feel like I had that experience reading your book. So thank you so much for writing it.
Well, thank you. I really, really appreciate that.
And thank you so much, Phil Christman, for coming on the podcast. Really great talking to you.
Yeah, good to talk to you.
All right, there you have it. The book is Midwest Futures, and if you want to check it out, we do have an ebook version available on our Cloud Library app, and the physical format is being processed currently. With the pandemic, we don't exactly know when we'll be able to get that into your hands, but you still can put yourself on the wait list for that. To do either of those things, a good starting place is the library's website, cooklib.org, and that's where you can go to search the catalog and then also find out everything you need to know about all of our e-library services. While you're on our website, take some time to head over to our blog, Shelf Life. It's the best place where you can interact with us librarians about book recommendations, get some local history stories, and some genealogy tips, along with a whole lot more. That blog can be found at shelflife.cooklib.org. If you would like to reach out to us anytime, talk to us on Twitter at Cook Library, or you can email us, send those messages to webmaster@cooklib.org. If you liked this episode, please tell others in your life all about it and let them know that they can catch this episode along with any of our past episodes in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or really anywhere they like to get their podcasts. We will be back soon, but until then, keep reading, keep watching, and keep listening.